It's, yeah, it is.
In 1918, President Wilson announced his plan, known as 14 Points, that would be used to bring peace to Europe again. However, the Allied forces suffered harsher losses than the United States did, and they were looking for serious punishment for Germany, not peaceful restoration. In 2001, when the Twin Towers were attacked, the Bush administration declared a worldwide war on terror. His plan entailed new security legislation, efforts to block the funding of terrorist activities, and other ideals to further secure our nation. In 2012, I visited Washington, D.C. While in our nation's capital, we toured the Pentagon. The Pentagon is headquarters of the United States Department of Defense and literally a five-sided steel and concrete 6 million square foot building. 184 lives were taken on September 11, 2001. While inside the Pentagon, we were not permitted to take pictures, and the tour guide leading our group and the other groups were not permitted to walk with their backs toward us for their own safety. Touring the Pentagon made me realize how much Bush's war on terror has impacted our country. Even though both world wars have long since ended, Wilson's 14 Points plan could be applied to today's war on terror. In the grand scheme of things, Wilson's plan was aimed at peace, and using most of these same concepts, peace could quite possibly be attained today. After reading this speech, I hope that you will realize what Wilson's 14 Points and Bush's war on terror was, how the two plans coincide, and how Wilson's 14 Points could be applied to today's war on terror. I will now explain what exactly Wilson's 14 Points was, and what Bush's war on terror was. President Wilson hoped that World War I would be the war to end all wars, but soon after entering the war, he learned that the Allied government had different views than he did. Wilson learned about secret agreements between the Allies to make Germany pay huge reparations or to take land from the Central Powers after the war ended. President Wilson responded by trying to clarify to the rest of the world what exactly the United States was fighting for. President Wilson addressed Congress on January 1, 1918, with this in mind. In his famous speech, 14 Points, he summarized the ideas that represented the United States' goals for war. He believed that if these points were established after the war, that this world would be a democratic and peaceful place to live. His first 5 points were general principles that aimed at removing the causes of war. The first point was aimed at the peace agreements, and that they should be arrived at openly and not secretly. The reason for this was in regard to the secret deals he learned about when the United States entered the war. The second point was the free use of the seas for all nations in wartime and in peace, and this was in response to the United Waters and U-boats. The third point was economic barriers to free trade, that they should be removed, which would remove the types of rivalry that led to wars. The fourth point was that arms should be reduced to a point that would allow nations to defend themselves but not threaten their neighbors. The fifth point was that the interests of colonial peoples should be considered and studied on colonial disputes, which meant that the countries that had colonies should be considered the people's desires who live in those colonies. Points 6 through 14 were territorial readjustments that would take place in Europe after the war ended. Much like Wilson, after his country was attacked by terrorists in 2001, Bush wanted peace. The Bush administration then implemented the war on terror. The president announced his military campaign on September 20th, 2001. In this speech to Congress, he said, "Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it is not in there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated." The war on terror was aimed at defeating terrorists, extinguishing supports to terrorist groups, and destroying terrorists and their organizations, but most importantly, defending United States citizens at home and abroad. I will now explain how Wilson's 14 Points and Bush's war on terror coincide. Wilson hoped his speech would encourage the Central Powers to end the wartime hostilities. The main one of Wilson's reasons for entering the war had ironically been to establish peace. He felt certain that if he or another unbiased statesman did not attend the peace accords, the European powers would continue fighting over land and colonial rights, and no permanent peace would ever be established. It did not come as a surprise that after the armistice, President Wilson himself went to Europe and attended the peace conference, despite the advice for his political allies and friends and protests. Wilson's plan was a plan for peace, and similar to Wilson, Bush's plan strived for peace in the lives of United States citizens. President Bush wanted to destroy every trace of terrorism and protect the citizens of this great nation. The two men, both former presidents of America and both faced with lofty circumstances, had another thing in common: they both wanted peace. I will now explain how Wilson's 14 Points can be applied to today's war on terror. President Wilson's plan pushed for peace and world unity. His points were aimed at establishing a League of Nations in order to bring together the many countries that were involved in the conflict. I feel like if our government were to establish Wilson's plans, it could be very beneficial in bringing together the conflicting countries of the world. In conclusion, I will summarize the points I listed during my speech and why they are important. Wilson's 14 points was a plan devised to bring about lasting peace after World War I. Bush's plan was one that aimed to destroy all terrorism and protect citizens of the United States. If Wilson's points were implemented today, his aim for unity and peace would have an exponential difference in conflicting countries of this world. The speech that President Wilson delivered, that later became known as his 14 points, is very similar to the plan that President Bush put into action after September 11th. Today's Wilson's plans for peace could be used to end conflict in the world. Even though Wilson's plan didn't exactly succeed during the war, it holds potential for the war on terror. His plan was an important example of peace, ethics, and motivation. The ideals were legitimate, and Wilson had a great end in mind. If the government pushed Wilson's 14 points policy and applied it to the current situation of today, there could be substantial amount of peace developed.